My husband had me sent to death row for a crime I never committed. The night before my execution, what I discovered didn't just save my life. It revealed a darkness in the man I married that was colder than the lethal injection waiting for me. Caleb Thorne stood in that courtroom, playing the part of the victim perfectly until the moment he turned on me. I can still see him lunging forward in his sharp blue suit, his face twisted in fake outrage. He pointed a shaking finger right in my face and screamed for the jury to hear. "She's a monster. My wife poisoned him to take the empire for herself." Those words didn't just end my freedom, they marked me for death. 10 years of my life were stolen, spent counting down the minutes in a concrete box while he lived in our mansion. But the truth was buried in a secret recording that would surface just minutes before midnight, and it was about to turn the hunter into the hunted. Quick thing, where are you watching from? Comment below. And if stories of betrayal and survival pull you in, subscribe and like now. This story starts right now. The memory always starts with the smell. Floor wax and old wood, barely masking the scent of sweat and fear. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with reporters hungry for the final act of the Black Widow trial. I stared at the jury foreman, a man who refused to look me in the eye, and I knew before he even opened his mouth that my life was over. Beside me, Caleb sat rigid in his tailored blue suit, the very picture of a devastated husband standing by his accused wife. He had spent the last weeks painting me as unstable, jealous, and dangerous, yet here he was, playing the martyr until the bitter end. We, the jury, find the defendant, Eliza Thorne, guilty of capital murder in the first degree. The collective gasp from the gallery sucked the oxygen right out of the room. My knees buckled, but I didn't fall. I couldn't. I was paralyzed by the sheer weight of the lie that had just crushed me. Then came the sentencing phase, a blur of legalese that sharpened into a single terrifying phrase: lethal injection. That was the moment Caleb reached for my hand. To the cameras flashing behind us, it was a gesture of broken-hearted solidarity, a husband clinging to his wife as she was condemned. I felt his palm against mine, warm and dry, while my own skin felt like ice. I turned to look at him, searching for a shred of the man I had loved, the man I had built a pharmaceutical empire with. His eyes were wet, his face crumpled in performed agony, but his hand told a different story. As the judge's gavel rose to seal my fate, Caleb didn't tremble. He didn't cling to me in desperation. Instead, he squeezed my hand, hard. It wasn't a squeeze of comfort, it was a pulse of pure, unadulterated victory. A sharp, deliberate pressure that lasted just a second too long to be accidental. In that fleeting contact, the facade dropped for an audience of one. I saw the flash of cold satisfaction in his peripheral vision, the slight twitch of a smile he quickly suppressed. He had done it. He had stolen our company, framed me for his crimes, and now he was sending me to the execution chamber to ensure I could never speak again. The gavel came down with a sound like a gunshot, but the real blow had already landed in the palm of my hand. They call it administrative segregation, but for 10 years, this 6x9 box was simply a concrete coffin where I waited to die. There is no day or night here, only the constant, maddening hum of fluorescent lights and the rhythmic clanking of heavy steel doors. Time became a physical weight, crushing my chest a little more with each sunrise I couldn't see. I spent 3,650 days staring at the same gray cinder blocks, calculating the exact number of breaths I had left before the state stopped them forever. The silence was heavier than the steel bars. In the beginning, there were letters, frantic promises of support from friends who swore they knew I was innocent. But as the appeals failed and the years dragged on, the ink dried up. The people who had once toasted to our success at our holiday parties, who had eaten at my table and laughed at my jokes, slowly drifted away. They chose the comfort of Caleb's luxury and the safety of his lies over the stigma of a condemned woman. One by one, they ghosted me, leaving me alone to wonder if I had already ceased to exist in the world above, long before the needle would make it official. I had already declined the chaplain's offer for a final prayer and left my last meal, a tray of lukewarm mashed potatoes, untouched on the steel table. The countdown was now measured in heartbeats, not hours. I was making peace with the silence when the heavy clang of the visitation door shattered my focus. I expected the warden coming to read the death warrant one last time. Instead, a young man stumbled into the room, clutching a battered briefcase like a life preserver. His name was Leo, a frantic junior public defender who looked like he hadn't slept in a week. He wasn't the slick, high-priced legal shark I had exhausted my fortune on years ago. He was a kid in a polyester suit 2 sizes too big, sweating through his shirt. He didn't waste time on pleasantries or pity. He slammed a file onto the divider between us, his hands trembling so violently he nearly knocked over his water cup. "Look at the timestamps, Eliza," he whispered, his voice cracking with adrenaline. "Just look." He pressed a copy of the original toxicology report against the glass. I squinted at the faded text I had memorized 1,000 times, but Leo pointed to a footnote in the chemical breakdown, a tiny jagged line I had always assumed was printer noise. "That's not an artifact," he hissed. "It's a metabolite, a specific chemical stabilizer that wasn't even patented until 6 months after the murder." He looked up at me, his eyes wild with the terrifying hope of the impossible. "The poison in your husband's partner wasn't from the batch in your lab. It was a prototype, one that only Caleb had access to." "But chemistry is circumstantial," Leo said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "We needed a smoking gun, and Caleb was arrogant enough to leave one." He reached into his briefcase again, not for a document, but for a small silver flash drive that caught the harsh glare of the prison lights. He told me about a woman named Vanessa. She was the one who replaced me in Caleb's bed before the sheets were even cold. A sleek, ambitious executive assistant who thought she was the exception to his cruelty. She wasn't. When Caleb discarded her last month like a used wrapper to make room for someone younger, she didn't just get angry, she got even. She had tracked Leo down just hours ago in a diner parking lot, handing over what she called Caleb's doomsday file. It was a cloud drive backup he had hidden under a shell company, a digital trophy case of his conquests and crimes. He had recorded himself the night of the murder, not out of guilt, but out of pride. He wanted a record of his own brilliance, a twisted insurance policy to blackmail the board if they ever tried to oust him. He thought he was untouchable, a god playing with human lives. But in his hubris, he had handed his cast-aside mistress the weapon to destroy him. Leo gripped the drive, his knuckles white against the battered leather of his case. He confessed, Eliza, every word, every drop of poison. It's all here. The leather straps dug into my wrists, binding me to the gurney in the center of the stark white room. I stared up at the ceiling tiles, counting the specks of dust to keep from screaming as the medical technician swabbed the crook of my arm. The smell of antiseptic was sharp and stinging, the scent of a hospital applied to a slaughterhouse. I felt the prick of the IV needle sliding in, the highway for the poison that would stop my heart in less than 10 minutes. Beyond the glass partition, the blinds remained drawn, but I knew Caleb was there, settling into his front row seat to watch the final flickering of the life he had stolen. The clock on the wall read 11:55 p.m. The warden stepped forward, a piece of paper in his hand, clearing his throat to read the death warrant. I closed my eyes, taking what I thought was the last deep breath of my life. And then, the silence was shattered. The shrill ring of the red telephone on the wall cut through the room like a siren. It was a sound so loud, so unexpected, that the technician actually jumped, nearly ripping the line from my arm. The warden froze mid-sentence, his eyes darting to the phone that everyone said was just a formality, a prop that never rang. He snatched the receiver, his knuckles white. I watched his face drain of color as he listened to the voice on the other end. He looked at me, then at the clock, then back at the technician. "Stand down," he barked, his voice trembling for the first time in 10 years. "Governor's orders, we have a stay." The words hung in the air, impossible and heavy, as the air rushed back into my lungs in a violent, sobbing gasp. It took 3 weeks for the state crime lab to confirm what the digital confession had already proven. The microscopic skin cells recovered from the stopper of the poison vial, evidence the prosecution had dismissed as inconclusive 10 years ago, were a perfect, irrefutable match for Caleb Thorne. The science was cold and absolute, stripping away the lies my husband had carefully constructed to bury me. When the judge slammed his gavel down this time, the sound didn't echo with doom. It rang out like a lock clicking open. Conviction vacated. Immediate release. The process of leaving death row was a surreal, out-of-body experience. I was stripped of the orange jumpsuit that had been my second skin for a decade, the fabric worn thin by misery and cheap detergent. In its place, I pulled on a pair of jeans and a blouse brought by Leo, clothes that felt alien and impossibly light against my body. The guards, men and women who had watched me through a pane of glass as I slept, ate, and wept for 10 years, now averted their eyes. They stepped aside, clearing a path through the corridor where I had once been marched in shackles. There was no metal clinking around my ankles today, only the echo of my own footsteps on the linoleum, getting faster with every stride. When the heavy steel gates finally groaned open, the sensory overload nearly knocked me backward. The air didn't smell like antiseptic and rust anymore. It smelled of exhaust fumes, rain, and freedom. The sunlight was blinding, a physical weight that warmed skin that hadn't seen natural light since the trial. But it was the noise that hit me hardest. A roaring ocean of reporters surged against the police barricades, a chaotic wall of flashing cameras and shouting voices. These were the same outlets that had christened me the Black Widow, the same vultures that had feasted on my downfall. Now they were desperate for the redemption arc, screaming my name, begging for a soundbite, hungry for the story of the woman who came back from the dead. I stood on the concrete steps, squinting against the glare, and felt a strange, cold calm settle over me. They wanted tears. They wanted a trembling, broken woman grateful for a second chance. But as I looked into the lens of the nearest camera, I didn't smile. I wasn't just walking out of prison to live. I was walking out to hunt. The civil suit hit the docket at 9 a.m. sharp. A $50 million warhead aimed directly at the Thorne estate. But the courtroom was just the stage. The real execution happened on the airwaves. I weaponized the very media machine Caleb had used to bury me, booking every primetime interview slot available. I sat under the studio lights, calm and cold, and played the audio clips that Leo had recovered. The public listened to the grieving widower laughing about poison dosages and stock prices. I watched the polls shift in real time, the adoration for the pharmaceutical titan curdling into revulsion. Every morning, I leaked another document, another lie, dismantling his carefully curated reputation brick by brick. I wasn't just suing him for lost time. I was erasing his legacy while he was still alive to watch it fade. The board members who had protected him began to resign. Sponsors pulled out. And for the first time in his life, Caleb Thorne couldn't buy his way out of the narrative. He was trapped in the spotlight he loved so much, burning under the glare. The walls of the empire didn't just crack, they disintegrated. By Friday, the subpoenas were piling up faster than the snow on the tarmac where Caleb tried to make his final play. He wasn't running a business anymore. He was running for his life. He sped toward the private airfield in a rental car, his accounts already flagged by the agonizingly slow churn of the federal banking system. He had tried to wire $10 million to the Caymans that morning, only to watch the transaction decline, a digital freeze that hit him harder than a physical blow. At the hangar, the pilot he had tipped for years stood with his arms crossed, shaking his head. The plane was grounded.
Caleb screamed, his voice cracking with the desperate, jagged edge of a trapped animal, but the sound was drowned out by the wail of approaching sirens. They didn't come quietly. FBI SUVs swarmed the runway, boxing him in with a synchronized aggression that mirrored the raid he had once staged on my lab. When the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, the cameras were waiting. Tipped off, of course, by me. He looked into the lens, searching for a friendly face, a lawyer, a fixer, anyone from the old days, but his phone was silent. The senators he had bribed, the board members he had enriched, the brothers from his country club, they had all issued statements condemning his reprehensible actions before the ink on the arrest warrant was dry. He was alone, stripped of his fortune and his friends, dragged toward a patrol car while the world watched the king become a convict. The courtroom felt smaller this time, stripped of the media circus that had defined my own trial, leaving only the cold, hard machinery of the law. I sat in the front row, directly behind the prosecution table, wearing white, a sharp, deliberate contrast to the defendant. Caleb sat where I had once sat, but the tailored blue suit was gone. In its place was the county orange jumpsuit, ill-fitting and bright, marking him as property of the state. When the foreman stood up, there was no hesitation, no averted eyes. The truth was too loud to ignore. We, the jury, find the defendant, Caleb Thorne, guilty of capital murder. The judge didn't waste time on speeches. He looked over his spectacles with the weary disdain of a man who had seen true evil. You are hereby sentenced to death by lethal injection. The words hung in the air, a perfect, terrifying echo of the sentence that had stolen 10 years of my life. Caleb didn't scream, he didn't point or fight. He slumped forward, the air hissing out of him as if his arrogance had been the only thing holding his spine upright. As the bailiffs hauled him to his feet, the chains around his ankles clinked, the exact same sound that had haunted my nightmares. He turned to look at me, his eyes wide with the realization of the hell awaiting him. I didn't smile, I simply nodded, acknowledging the completion of the circle. They drove him away in the armored van that used to carry me, headed for the cell I had kept warm for him. But I didn't go home to the empty mansion. I went to a small, cluttered office downtown where the sign on the door was still smelling of fresh paint, the Thorne Justice Project. My name was no longer a headline for a victim or a murderer. It was a lifeline. I sat at my desk, picked up a pen, and pulled the first file from a stack of letters sent by inmates on death row who claimed they were innocent. Caleb was entering the darkness, but for the first time in a decade, I was ready to be the light.